because I see that I can't record it myself. So if you could,
Right.
yeah, send me the link or whatever.
So there you
I
go.
would.
I got it recording for us so we can kind of reference it. So I want to preface this whole conversation with a few things though, since I'm going to be posting it online. One, I'm not representing the views or perspectives of the CDC, Cigna Health, Citigroup, any of the companies that I've worked for, that I've done work for. This is not necessarily their perspective, their views. While I have personally developed some of these algorithms, some of them have been put in use and some of them have not been put into use. A lot of what I know and what I've worked with comes from a couple of different things. They come from conferences and a lot of presentations I've been to by people that worked on these type of algorithms, and then also working very closely with some of the clinical organizations of pharma companies that actually do this kind of work. So there's a lot of these kinds of things that come into the conversation whenever you're doing clinical trials or credit check work or any sort of like marketing type work. These are really common discussions about like, how do we minimize the impact of this stuff, right? So the other thing that I want to kind of preface this with is just that I'm also personally very interested in this topic. I'm a member of a UU church that does a lot of social justice work and fairness, type of like social justice type stuff. Um, so my perspective on this is it's a very important topic, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a matter of maximizing the profit for the company, but the thing is that plays a pretty important role, and there's socio economic things that factor into these equations that very commonly they're not addressed when you're talking about the ethics and the philosophy behind a lot of this stuff, right? And that dimension is very commonly ignored when you get into social justice circles. That it's very much about the little man when you get into social justice circles and they start talking about these topics. And what they don't take into consideration is the economic impact and the business impact of these different things. All right. So that's an important thing I just want to highlight there as well. All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and your questions are good questions, but they come from a very specific perspective. Okay, so I'll preface this video why we're even having this conversation. So, you sent me a link to a survey that you're doing that provides a couple different methodologies, statistical methodologies, strategies, very technical strategies for minimizing error in different ways, basically. And it's a
Right.
very technical approach to fairness. And they basically amount to minimizing overfitting is the idea on pretty much all those algorithms. And anytime you're building any sort of algorithm, there's a big risk with overfitting. And what that means is that the algorithm itself will not be generalizable and usable across a much larger group. And I'm saying this for the benefit of anybody who watches this video later, not for you, because I know you understand that. So that is a very technical, mathematical approach to fairness. And there's a couple other different dimensions that have to be taken into consideration when you're talking about fairness. There is a philosophical level conversation associated with it, which is how do you define fairness and what do you consider fair and who are you being fair to? And then there's a legislative component associated with fairness, associated with managing and directing the overall governmental approach to managing a country. And the goals there are not necessarily the same. It depends on the country, obviously, but in a democracy where everybody is treated equally before the law, the idea is you want to minimize unrest while maintaining civil stability and economic like positioning in the global world market. So it's a delicate balance that administrators of a country have to kind of like handle when they talk about fairness, right? So if you get into a country that's less balanced and fair and doesn't treat all of its citizens equally before the laws, what you get is these like mafia run countries that benefit a small group of people and they don't care about fairness at all. They don't care about equality at all. They just care about making them and their friends rich. So that they don't have the same kind of concerns and problems. But when you get into a country like the United States or most of the European countries, then you have to take these things into consideration. Now there's still that component of like make your friends rich going on in all those countries too, but it's not quite as exacerbated as someplace like Russia. And I'm picking on them because they're an easy target right now, right? So those three components are all pretty big factors when you talk about fairness and equality in artificial intelligence algorithms, because depending on how you define fairness is going to be how you approach the implementation of how you control those things. And you mentioned them yourself. I can't remember. You were actually very eloquent about it. I think it was, do you approach it from a controls perspective, a data perspective, or from the algorithm, the decision-making process perspective? Right. And I think a lot of times when people talk about fairness in AI, they focus overly on the decision-making process associated with that. And there's an implication here that the decision-making process is being done by people that do not care about fairness, and they also are going to be biased to themselves in their decision-making process. So we need to control that decision-making process. That's sort of the implication there, is that they are going to make unfair decisions in their decision-making process. So we need to control that decision-making process. True. I would say that that is true to a certain extent and in some situations. All right. So that kind of sets the stage for the whole conversation, right? The first example you gave about medical, and we can read through it if you want, but it basically boiled down to minimizing positive and negative errors across groups to provide fairness to one minority group that may not be fully represented, so that mortality rates are essentially the same across different groups as they're represented.
Yeah, basically distributing the errors and
Right.
the accuracies. Yeah.
Right. In the obvious example of this is things like clinical trials, right? Personal experience, where most of the research that's done is, and this is no secret, white, upper class European people who have time to participate in trials, honestly. And the drugs developed by mostly European descent people, for European descent people, and it's been fairly well documented, and you can research this, that these drugs tend to be less effective in other minority or other ethnic groups. So like in Asia, they're less effective. In Africa, they're less effective. But yet, they're the drugs that are available. So those are the ones that people use, right? So this is where it gets sticky. And kind of what I was alluding to in my comment back to you on the survey is, when you have a clinical trial scenario or any medical scenario whatsoever, the statistics and the group metrics around error and mortality, frankly, just straight up do not matter. The only thing that matters is whether or not you can save the life of the individual you're working with. And the only fair way to handle that situation is to do everything in your power and use every bit of information you have related to research or medical technology to save that individual. Now, what that means is you want to create as specialized and as well fit an algorithm as possible for that specific person. You use everything you know about them, where they live, their ethnic background, their religious background, if that plays, their diet, their family history. You use anything available to you that can give you any hint whatsoever on what the best course of treatment is. Make sense? And I think you kind of got that point, that the idea of fairness in medical treatment can't really be addressed via a technical statistical algorithm trying to, quote, normalize the errors across these different groups, because it is inherently unfair to the individuals who would have had a better chance of survival if you had treated them as an individual. Make sense?
Yeah,
So
yeah, and actually, yeah, like it was eye-opening. You argumented it that of course the end goal is to save as many lives as possible.
right.
But I was also interested in knowing, like, why would there be more data available for one ethnic group, and how can you also solve the problem if, of course, using group fairness metrics or fairness notions to solve this problem is not the way to go because it ignores the individual level.
Right.
Then yeah.
So they approach it a couple different ways in clinical trials and in medical research. Is what they try to do is get representative samples from as diverse a population as they can get. So they try to make sure that these underrepresented groups are participating in a part of the clinical trials. So this was true of like the Pfizer COVID trials, of all of the trials that have gone on with related to COVID. And the problem is, and you'll see this in a lot of the research and a lot of the publications, is that recruitment is particularly difficult in historically persecuted and mistreated groups, right? They don't want to be a part of a clinical trial because they don't trust the government, with good reason, I would add, right? There's a very long history of abuse in the medical community on some of these groups. So getting them, it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? If you want better drugs for your group, you have to participate and make yourself available for testing. But there is a history of abuse by these organizations on some of those groups and mistreatment, so they don't want to participate. So it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain extent there. But they do, you know, a large because of this history, it's been much more heavily regulated and it's tracked, at least in the FDA and in the United States. It's much more heavily regulated and reported on there. They're explicitly required to track and report on those types of things. And there's a lot of watchdog groups that like pay close attention to, is my group being represented and is it safe for my group? And you can look those groups up, but most large ethnic groups have some sort of like group watchdog group that kind of like pays attention to those kinds of things. And they publish things that recommend participation or not participation. I'm not going to go into too many specifics on some of those because frankly, there's, you know, I don't want to open myself up to any bad juju on any of that. But suffice it to say, the history of all of that is very well documented and very real. But the modern realization of that is that the risks associated with that have been dramatically reduced due to, you know, better communication, better representation, and better all of that. So from the perspective of medical science and clinical trials and all of that, fairness in an algorithm doesn't even play a part, in that you can't use an overfitting, you know, correction in order to create a fair algorithm. That's not a thing. You want as specific and as detailed and as useful an algorithm for the individual as you can possibly get, which basically means you use any piece of data that you can get your hands on. And for some groups, there's better data than others, and that's just, life's not fair. I don't know what to tell you. Life's not fair.
Yeah. So when the error rates differ a lot, you would say that perhaps the solution is also to look into it. Why?
Right. Right. So, and I have no doubt a lot of research done in that area as to why the error rate is higher in any specific group. And I would make the argument that anytime you do see some sort of disparity in a specific group, that should be an area of research that somebody should be digging into. And the obvious people that would have the most interest in doing that would be someone from that group. And you see that a lot. Like if some group is seeing some disproportionate representation, they'll start researching and digging in. And they don't always find the answers that they like, to be honest with you. Sometimes it says something about that group that they don't want to hear. And it's an unpopular opinion. And I say this because sometimes when you're having social justice conversations, you run into this quite a bit, where the cause or something that's a contributor to a problem, people just straight up socially do not want to discuss. And it's avoided, like dramatically avoided. And on a personal level, people cannot talk about those subjects. So you gotta like steer clear of some of them. Because the reality is there are differences between different groups that people are not comfortable with and make people upset. So it is what it is. So medical stuff, it all makes sense. I think most people, regardless of their personal belief system, would agree that at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is saving the individual whose life is in danger and providing the best, you know, drug for or treatment for whoever it is. Most people will not disagree with that whatsoever. Where it gets in the other two questions you talked, the other two revolved around credit scoring type activities, which is in the gray area in the middle. And then the third one, which is the farther extreme from the clinical trial medical world, which is just straight up like business marketing type activity, right? So I'm going to come back to the one that's in the middle with the credit scoring, because I've got a lot of information around banking that I could talk about with that. And there's a lot of different stakeholders, and it gets a little bit of an opinion-based, socioeconomic discussion there. And it's a stickier conversation than the pure marketing one, right? So the pure marketing one, it's not as clear cut as the medical, but more clear cut than the credit one, in that in the United States and in most capitalistic societies, the basic premise is buyer beware, right? It's your money, you spend it however you want. People can put whatever nonsense they want and market whatever they want to you. It's up to you as an individual, and the responsibility is on the individual to do their own research and to decide how to spend their money or what to not spend their money. Now, what that means is that they are allowed to, and they do consistently, all companies do, is they market to the demographic, the specific group that they think is most likely to spend money with them. The company themselves, their goal is to make a sale. End of story, end of discussion. They do not care most of the time. Now, granted, there's always malicious organizations out there, but most of the time, really all they care about is maximizing profit and revenue. So what they're going to do, and online advertising has taken all of this to a whole new level, right? Because you can find out based on browser history and whatnot, people's age, sex, preferences, buying history, browsing history. Hell, Google can even geolocate you. I mean, I don't know if you've ever gone into Google and looked at your geo map of where you've traveled, but if you've got an Android phone, they know every place you've been for the last 5 years. You literally are carrying around a tracking device. So the amount of information that's collected on an individual is so specific at this point. They can be very, very targeted with their ads. Now, from a fairness perspective, what does this mean? What it means is that it's completely unfair. It's absolutely completely unfair. What you'll see is, and the most common example of this is like malt liquor and cigarette ads in lower income or family areas, like residential areas. You'll see a lot more advertising related to like cigarettes and negatively socially impacting products in communities where, they're more susceptible to those kinds of, ads. And you're not going to see advertisements for Tesla cars down in the ghetto. What you're also not going to see is advertisements for schools or advertisements for credit, training or business training or entrepreneurial training or any of these kinds of other things that if you're in a more affluent community, you will see those kinds of ads. And what that creates is a little bit of a self-reinforcing socioeconomic situation, which is why fairness in advertising is a constant topic. Now, there have been pushes to kind of control some of that. I don't think, to my knowledge, I have not seen a whole lot of legislation or any sort of like controls associated with that. And I think a big part of that really boils down to, again, this capitalistic mentality and philosophical attitude of buyer beware. It's the responsibility of the individual. So the only really, there's, again, algorithmically, if you wanted to create something like that, you could require companies to distribute their ads across other demographics. Now, here's where that gets sticky and why it's a bad thing and why it will not go over well. They have to pay for those advertisements. It's an investment for them. They want to invest on the highest return possible on anything that they do. And you're essentially telling, don't think of them as big no-name companies. These are people. right? You're telling me that I have to spend my money on trying to advertise malt liquor to a rich Jewish community. Like, they don't drink malt liquor. None of them are even moderately interested in it. Not even a little bit, right? So that is money that you're essentially telling me as a company that I have to throw away, so that what? So that it's fair in your eyes, because in your opinion, you think that's fair. So there's a little bit of this like philosophical debate that goes on around trying to control how other people spend their money on things that they want to invest in, right? So it gets into a little bit of a gray area. And for something that is low impact in a capitalistic society, again, they say buyer beware. It's on the responsibility of the individuals to kind of mitigate and control that themselves. And you'll see, you see that consistently in advertising.
Yeah, I understand the fact of also thinking about the institution or the business that is putting the algorithm out there in the market,
right?
And incorporate them in this, like ethical fairness framework. So also accounting for the view.
Right.
But
That's the common thing that happens in these ethics and AI and fairness and algorithms conversations, is that the stakeholder that is not considered is honestly the most important stakeholder, which is the institution that is investing the money. Because if whatever fairness algorithm that is trying to be adjusted essentially comes straight out of their pockets.
Yeah.
And so if it becomes too unfair to them, they will decline to participate, which actually does more damage to the community as a whole, because that service is no longer available at all.
Yeah. But I was more interested in, because of course, when you talk about buying and selling, the errors is a little bit more clear. But when we're talking about STEM ad jobs, so in science, technology, and whatnot, then there is a little bit more of a social dilemma when you're talking about the errors, and when you're talking about the differences between women and men.
Right.
So this example particular was designed around this kind of algorithm.
Oh, so like the disparity between men and women representation in STEM. Right.
Exactly.
Right,
So you have qualified women, you have qualified men, but you also have unqualified women and unqualified men.
Right. So I would put that closer to like similar to the credit score and lending kind of conversation than to the pure, I have a service or a good that I want to market, and it may be beneficial or negative to the population that I'm advertising it to. When you're talking about like marketing the products and services, usually people are only concerned about fairness in representation when they're talking about negatively socially impacting products like drugs and tobacco and I don't know, you can come up with some other negative products potentially, or negatively impacting products, but that's usually what they're talking about. Nobody cares if Cheerios is fairly advertised across social groups. They don't care about that one, right? Nobody talks about that.
So maybe
there's
that's
no
why
impact.
So maybe that's why also you answered as in demographic parity would work. So setting just quotas for both women and men, and just randomly showing up the ad. But in terms of STEM ad jobs, then again the situation would be quite similar to the financial.
So that leads into the third question. We'll kind of talk in a bit about that. So when you so the premise of your questions really, part of the reason I kind of objected initially and was kind of like you're kind of missing some of the key components here was because the premise was that there's a very strong there's a common misrepresentation and understanding in statistics by people who are not statisticians, and they think they're educated. They can be even doctorates. I've seen people with doctorates make these kinds of really bad assumptions about representational statistics, and there's usually this false sense that happens where there's a statistic that shows a disproportionate representation on a topic. And the men-women thing is a perfect example of that, to be frank.
Yeah.
Now, there's a reason why there's a disparity there. And it's a really unpopular opinion. People will say, well, women make 80% of men. And that is true to a certain extent. But when you dig into the research, what you find that the immediate, let me start over. The immediate thing that people jump to on that is sexism. It's an easy explanation for a very complicated problem, is what it is. And I've seen very educated, informed people jump to that conclusion because, when you see a disparity that huge, it's really easy to think that there's a simple explanation for it. But what is really going on there when you dig into the deeper analysis by sociologists and people that have actually spent the time researching and digging into this is that there's a lot of other factors that play into that disparity between men and women. And I'm sure you've read some of this already, and there is merit to some of it. I did not want to believe some of it, but the digger you deep, the more convincing the research becomes, in that the actual percentage of the disparity related and directly attributable to sexism is actually relatively small. Most of the disparity has to do with things like time off work, health concerns, maternity leave is much more common, obviously, for women.
Yeah.
More likely to take breaks, much more likely to not advance in their own career educationally because they drop out of graduate school, more common for the same sorts of issues. There's a lot, and those are just the ones that jumped out in my head. Most of them had to do with physical, medical reasons why women are more prone to be hampered in their career educationally or professionally. And that is a harsh reality of just a difference between the sexes. There are more physiological things going on with women. But that is not something that women want to hear particularly. And it's not something that like people who are very social justice minded want to hear particularly either. The actual attribute to like sexism was still there. It didn't exist. It is a thing that consistently did happen, but it was not 20% pay difference. It was more like 5 or whatever. I'm making up numbers, but it was, the majority of it was this list of like 20 other factors associated with this. And so there's this base assumption that representational statistics imply whatever the top cause might be associated with that thing. So the natural jump for pay disparity is sexism, but there's actually much more than that. And the same thing happens with clinical trials, right? So the disparity between treatment between group A, which is usually white Europeans, and non-whites is usually attributed because of racism. But the reality is it's a lot of other factors associated with representation in the clinical trials, mostly. Getting subjects that are willing to participate of any given group, right? So there's a lot of other factors that play into it, but the immediate, obvious, easy thing to jump to is that there's racism and bias associated with that. So does that help? So that's the first thing I just want to address associated with these more complicated conversations around STEM representation and clinical, or not clinical, financial implications like credit score and lending practices and things like that. So how this matters and why this matters to lending. I'll focus on lending, right? Because it's obviously an important topic, and access to the resources for lending, for doing business growth or building a business, or building a new house. Access to those kinds of resources is obviously a big, important thing to all people, but it is disproportionately impacts minority groups because they are not able to get as many or as good of loans. So again, this base assumption that disproportionately unable to get loans or disproportionately unable to get access to these financial things is usually attributed to racism. But it's a factor, but less of a factor than I think people think it is. And if you do the research, you dig into it, usually there's secondary issues or secondary concerns going on that are a part of that. Does that make sense? So I'll dig into because the impact in lending is so huge, that's where you see legislative bodies and the government start to step in to try to, quote, make things fair. And that's when it really does start to matter. The fairness equation really matters in this gray area middle ground where the stuff is important enough that from a social group perspective needs to be addressed, but not important enough that overfitting and unfairness is okay. It's in that gray area where you're trying to steer the direction of society as a whole and provide this balance between civil unrest and equality before the law and social equality. That's where these things really start to matter. The reason you can, some of the dimensions are explicitly forbidden in legislation from being used. You're not allowed to use most of the, what people would consider prejudicial practices are explicitly forbidden by the law from these institutions. So like race, ethnic, any sort of like religious, ethnic, identity, sexual orientation, things like that, right? These things are all kind of specifically forbidden and the proxies associated with them. So like you can't use zip code, for example, when generating credit score or lending. But you can look at other things, right, that are surprising probably to a lot of people. There's nothing that says that you can't look at people's social media posts and profile. So, and I've actually been at a presentation by a credit score company that will remain unnamed, where they were scraping people's social media profiles and pulling all their data in to try to do an analysis for a risk profile for those individuals.
And you could argument that that's basically a proxy, no? You could get proxies to those protected attributes.
Right. You could, but as long as they're not using it as a proxy, then you're fine. So the example he gave was people who complain about their gas bill in social media. Yeah. If somebody is stupid enough to put on a billboard on the internet and say, man, my gas bill's out of hand, I'm not going to pay it this month, that guy is much higher risk from a financial credit perspective.
Of course.
Right? Of course he is.
Yeah.
But the implications of that are really scary and should be scary for people, right? Because given the technology and AI with the ability to do automatic identification of pictures and what is in pictures, what you can do is you can scan somebody's profile, and this is just an example, pull all their pictures down and enumerate, like from a numeric, mathematical, like monetary perspective, how much the value of all their possessions are. You follow me? This guy has a 75-inch TV in his front living room and a $15,000 couch. He's obviously affluent, right? And so I'll give him a better score. Or maybe, depending on other indicators, I'll give him a worse score because he's spending money on things that, frankly, he doesn't have the money to be spending on. If he's making $25,000 a year and he has a $15,000 couch in his house, probably not a good investment for an institution to give money to. He's going to lose it and he's not going to pay it back. Whereas the guy who's making $250,000 who has a $15,000 couch, probably fine, right? So it's a matter of, debt to income ratio kind of thing, but they can use online data that you make available to sort of like try to like adjust those scores, right? But they cannot use the color of your skin or your religion or some of these other things that are explicitly forbidden.
Yeah. But still pretty crazy.
It is still pretty crazy what they can use, right? And the other thing too is that there's other things that end up being tertiary indicators of ethnicity that are not explicitly forbidden. And really, when they go through an audit and they have to explain how the algorithm and the calculation works to the auditors, the auditor can call BS on things, right? And say, no, you can't use that. That's a proxy for
Yeah.
racial identity, right?
All right. But okay, and in the case of immigrants and non-immigrants, you said that the measurement bias, or let's say the discrimination or direct discrimination, we call it racism, is very, very small. And actually the disparity can be explained by other attributes.
I don't know if I would say it's
That.
very small. It's
And
smaller than
also,
people think, right?
and also if the other attributes might not be directly associated to discrimination, but also indirectly
Right. So they end up
associated.
being secondary or tertiary risks that are associated with that group that are not necessarily associated. So think of it from this perspective. You have to sit. First, I want to clarify. There's a different conversation between racism against immigrants and racism by institutions in lending against immigrants. Does that make sense? There's a difference there. There is very real discrimination that happens against immigrants. There's very real discrimination that happens against all these groups. It's just how much of an impact and how much of it is institutionalized is really when you start talking about fairness and algorithms, when it comes into a factor. And the idea there, and the whole point of the fairness, is to provide the same opportunities to improve their lives that the people that are not being discriminated against get, right? That's the whole point. So I want to clarify that it's not that there's not discrimination, it's that is not the only reason, and simple explanations very rarely provide a way out of the problem, the very real problem of the fact that these people have lesser access to these resources. Does that make sense? So you can't just chalk it up to racism and say, if people weren't racist, these people would get what they needed, right? Because one, it doesn't really truly address all the issues that are contributing to the problem. And worse, it doesn't actually help the people that need the help more than anything. So if you want to address the need for help, you have to sit in the shoes of an investor for a minute, right? And you need to understand what their perspective is and what they're trying to accomplish, and understand what a credit score or a lending rate actually represents and what it means. And what it means and represents is, how likely is this person to pay back the money I'm getting them? Forget about racism, forget about all these other factors whatsoever. They can all be gray lumps of clay. How likely is this lump of clay to pay back my money? Now, if I'm a creditor and I'm looking for a return on investment, think of it sort of like from the perspective of the dying man, right? I'm dying. I have to get the best return on this or else I die, right? What am I going to do? I am going to go the clinical trial route, and I'm going to use every piece of information that may benefit me to get the best possible return of investment that I can possibly get. And it is a very self-serving, selfish way to approach lending. Now, right. So from the perspective of a lender, they are dying, they are the patient. They are going to look for the best outcome that they can possibly get, which is invest the least amount of money and get the highest rate of return. So philosophically, where this gets sticky is the social and civil and economic impact associated with that kind of practice. And what it does is that if you only go with the low risk, high return people, there are going to be whole swaths of people that are completely marginalized and cut out of society, essentially, by the people that are in power, and it becomes this self-reinforcing cycle. So that's where government steps in, because left to their own device, every individual will choose that path. Why? Well, not every individual. Most individuals, especially the little guys, that the closer you get to an individual, the closer they're going to be self-serving. So what ends up happening is, in order to essentially do fair practices and normalize the risk across society and minimize things like civil unrest and general discontent with society, they put laws in place to minimize prejudicial lending practices with some of the controls I said. You're not allowed to use race, ethnicity, religious background, sexual preference or orientation. You're not allowed to use a lot of those things because those are the things that people use to minimize their risk or to push whatever agenda they may have. Right.
Yeah.
There
But
are
even
right.
without those protected attributes and those proxies, you can still reach
Right.
discrimination, can't you?
You can. So you can still discriminate, and they find these secondary or tertiary indicators.
Right.
The other thing too is that it also, when you start talking about discrimination, and the implication is that they're not lending to these groups because of their race or because of their preferences or because of their location that they live in, and that may be true, but the reason that you wouldn't lend to somebody that lives in the Ukraine right now is not because you hate Ukrainians. It's because there's a good chance it's going to get bombed and blown up, right? There is a risk associated with being physically located in Ukraine right now. And that doesn't have anything to do with a bias against Ukrainians as a group. It has to do with a bias against the risk associated with being in a war zone. Do you follow the logical leap there? So
Yes.
yeah. So it's your money, and
But
you
we're
can lend
talking
to
about
me.
an area of risk and
Right.
comparing it to a type of people.
Right. And but there are cultural things that contribute to risk, right? So from the perspective of a lender, you have the choice. Sit in the seat of a lender. Would you rather, lend to a wealthy New Yorker who has a consistent history of paying out back his debts, or would you rather lend money to and I have family in the Philippines, so a poor Filipino farmer who gets hit with a hurricane every other season? Your choice. It's your money. What are you going to do? It's not as easy an answer as people would like. It's really easy to tell other people how to spend their money. When it is your money, it is a much more difficult decision to make. And the reality is that if you weren't on camera and you were literally making this decision, actually making this decision behind closed doors with no one watching and no real accountability, it would be a very easy decision to make. You lend to the people that.
But that doesn't. Of course, but that doesn't mean that my answer is correct or could be justified.
It's correct, and this gets to this is where it gets into a philosophical debate.
Exactly. Right?
Yeah. You can talk about the moral correctness and whatnot, but matter of moral perspective from the individual versus but at the end of the day, right? You can count on people to do a few things. One, they're going to do what's in their own personal self-interest. And two, when you talk to governing bodies, their responsibility is to a broader group of people. So they will legislate or try to impose these sort of fairness practices on those who do have this disproportionate amount of power when it comes to lending, credit scores, and things like that. So that's why these legislation bodies are in place and why they do what they do. Now, the difficult part in we kind of danced around a little bit, but there are some groups that are just genuinely more inherently risky to invest in, and not just because of where they physically are. There is some cultural differences between different groups that make them, a little bit more irresponsible with money than other groups, right?
But that's judging them as a group, and you could also justify that discriminating that group would also not be fair in the individual level, because a lot of people within that group would
now you're starting to get it, which is why you can't use statistics to decide how to handle across groups, because the individuals in any given group will not necessarily conform to that rule of that group. As a lender, I want to group things, and I want to make my decision-making process as simple as possible. I don't want to take the time and effort, because it takes a lot of time and effort and investment to figure out whether or not an individual fits the mold of his group or not. What is easy is I'm looking for lead indicators of what will happen in the future. And if I have an easy precursor that will give me an easy signal that will tell me this person is risky, like, and I'm going to pick on people with face tattoos, right? Because I think everybody understands or accepts the fact that if you get a face tattoo, probably not a good decision maker, right? Let's be real. That's with you for the rest of your life. You're telling everybody, I got some stuff going on here, and I want everybody to know about it, right? Is it okay to discriminate against people with face tattoos? Absolutely not. Because you might be talking to the guy with a face tattoo that's a multimillionaire, and I've met them, right? Who is incredibly successful, who got a face tattoo, right? But let's be real. Your average guy you run into at a Quick Trip or on a convenience, store that has a spider tattooed on his face, probably not the kind of guy you want to lend $1 million to, right? So there are certain things that are lead indicators that if you get to know them really well, probably, maybe they won't fall into that mold. But that takes time, man. If I can, the quicker they make their decision, the cheaper the decision is to make, which drives down the cost associated with that transaction. The lower the cost, the higher the return on investment. And so they're looking for any way to minimize the costs associated with the lending practices. So does that all make sense? So what it is it means that it's unfair, inherently unfair to the people that are in the lower end of those transactional groupings that they get put in. It is inherently unfair. Now, the question becomes, what type of grouping is fair and which kind of grouping is unfair? The kind of groupings that are considered fair are anything that has to do with your financial performance, your historical financial performance as an individual, which is why they include current net worth, assets, debt ratio, and payback consistency. So like if you miss payments on things, that's considered a negative. So those things are all well within the range and used for the game, right?
The argument for fairness metrics or group fairness metric is also that those variables could be biased.
Right.
Right? So, because let's say an immigrant has less opportunities to expand his or her network or receives less aid from the government.
Right.
So that's the premise that although you do have those variables to calculate risk, those variables could be biased.
Right. And it is also still grouping, right? So you can't that's still grouping to a certain extent, right? You're saying these immigrants have these kinds of like negative things they're trying to overcome, and you try to compensate for them but you can't do it in the algorithm during the decision-making process still, is what I'm trying to tell you. Because if you try to incorporate a normalization technique across groups, you're accepting the premise that those groups are being singled out because of that grouping. Does that make sense? You've accepted, if you're trying to normalize it with that error, you've essentially inherently accepted the fact that the primary reason why they are disadvantaged is because of discrimination by people who are doing the lending or whatever, right? When in reality, it's much more nuanced and complicated than that. Their grouping can be an indication of all of these other factors that contribute to that grouping. So, and immigrants, in the example you gave of just now of the immigrants don't have as good of a social network, they're new to the area, they haven't been able to establish a credit history or a spending history or an earning history, those kinds of things. Those are much more difficult to overcome, and they're also, unfortunately for immigrants, something that is acceptable to bias against, right? Because there is an inherent risk associated with somebody who has no history, no network, no background. You're asking them to essentially take a gamble on somebody they know virtually nothing about, other than the fact that they're an immigrant, which is an inherently risky group, because usually they're fleeing some sort of like, bad situation. And oftentimes you lose a lot of assets or net worth when you have to like relocate from an immigrant perspective. It's inherently just sucks, right? So they're already at a disadvantage because they've been displaced. And then they're at the secondary disadvantage that they do not have access to the capital and the startup capital needed to get back on your feet. Now, that being said, here's a complete the example that breaks the rule, right? I have had the advantage and the experience. I dated a Cuban girl for a while, and in like my early 20s, and I went to a Thanksgiving dinner with her, and this is like in the early aughts, and it was all Cuban immigrants that had been displaced in the 60s by Fidel Castro. And these, I don't know what you know about the Cuban Revolution, but basically it was an eat the rich situation where the lower classes said, we're going to take all the money from the upper classes and redistribute it. So inherently what happened is all the rich people and all the people that owned businesses and had money grabbed everything they could physically carry and went to Miami. And what happened is there was tens or thousands or hundreds of thousands, I don't know, lots of rich Cuban businessmen and people who knew how to take care of business left Cuba and organized. And what I saw at this table was really mind blowing to me, because there was probably about 15, I'm talking about guys in their 80s and 90s and women in their 80s and 90s. And all of them, were multimillionaires again, all of them. It took them 30, 40 years to get back to where they were when they were in Cuba, because they all had plantations or had a steel business. One guy had a meat packing plant when he was in Cuba. But what they did is they took their institutional knowledge and they came to the United States with nothing, most of them. They maybe sold some of the jewelry they were able to carry with them and got a little bit of startup capital. But one of the guys owned a meat packing plant in Colorado again already, and he was a multimillionaire. Another lady had like started a whole like designer business and was doing like textiles work. So like there's this really weird thing where this immigrant community, because the way they had been displaced and the just amount of education and whatever that they had available to them, blew me away how they were able to flip it all and all become incredibly successful, way more successful than any of my history or ancestors. And I'm a white male in the United States. It doesn't get much luckier than that, like frankly. So there's a certain amount of like, I'm a white male in the United States, not even close to the level of success that these people, that these educated folks from Cuba had. And they knew some things that I frankly was never taught growing up. And so it was really a really fascinating dynamic. So they're the exception that breaks the rules.
Yeah.
When I was in St. Louis, there was during Bosnia had a big civil war problem, whatnot, during the 90s. And there was a huge influx of Bosnian immigrants that were relocated to St. Louis. And I saw a very strong, disproportionate, disadvantaged group that were not massively educated, successful people in business. They were average, normal people that had been brought to St. Louis and just relocated. And they struggled. Like, some of them did well, some of them did not do well, but you saw some of those kind of practices and some of those things go on there. So the short version is there is an inherent difference between those two populations that did not have anything to do with ethnic background, or the fact that, well, it did have to do with ethnic background, but it did not have anything to do with the fact that they were immigrants. Being an immigrant themselves did not immediately discount or make them hugely disadvantaged for the Cubans. They were able to not only like thrive, but honestly take off and be incredibly successful, right? So there's a lot going on there. It's a very complicated problem, and I would love to see like a comparison between the two groups of like, and I'd also like to see where the Bosnians are at in 40 years. Maybe there's going to be a huge success there. My wife's family are immigrants, and now again, terrible example. They're all doctors, right? They came here from the Philippines during unrest in the 60s and 70s, and they came over here and have been hugely successful here. All of them are, doing very well. So there's a certain amount of like, my personal experience with immigrants is that they are disadvantages. They do not have as many opportunities. They do not have the network. But what I found is that they build their own internal network. They connect with others of their own community, and they become a much stronger, tighter knit group, and they lift each other up and support each other a lot more. And they also tend to be much more driven than the incumbents in the area. Of whoever happens to be living there already is perfectly happy to, like, work in whatever job it is they have available to them. Meanwhile, the immigrants are like, I got to get back to where I was, wherever I was at. Or they're grateful for the opportunity that they didn't have where they were at. So either way, I've seen mostly immigrants just absolutely thrive, especially in the United States. I don't know what it's like in Europe, but my experience in France was very different. When I was in France, I saw.
Yeah, I think that's the hustler, the hustler view of it. Work hard and you'll make it. But of course, that's a very, I believe, a very small proportion of the immigrants that do make it.
Yeah, I think it's also different depending on what society you're in too, right? So in the United States, there's all these controls and rules to prevent discrimination. Whereas in France, when I was there, one of the things that blew me away is how few protections and controls were in place to help immigrant populations. So I don't know what you know about France, but there's a huge Algerian population that comes from Africa because it was a colony at one point, and they're all French citizens, and so they're allowed to come and go. But the thing that I saw there is that there was open racism and discrimination going on, just commonplace, and it was almost like expected and standard. And I inquired about it, and one of the biggest differences between the way France and the United States handles discrimination is that they are forbidden to discuss or measure or track any of those types of metrics in France. They're not allowed to track any of the, ratios of, men to women or, minorities to whites or any of those kinds of things. And so there's not even a discussion about racism in France for the most part. It's no, everybody is equal. We treat them all equally. But then in reality, what you see is there are whole areas of France that are ghettos that these poor people can't get out of and can't find any opportunity outside of the ghetto because they're actively, discriminated against.
Yeah, a similar thing happens in Sweden. In Stockholm, a lot of immigrants, they accepted a lot of immigrants, but they didn't really have an integration plan. So they started forming ghettos all around the outskirts of the city. And now it's a huge problem.
Right.
But I also think the context, the whole, like how you see the situation is influenced by the context. For example, you might be in a position. You might be in a position where you can meet immigrants that have been successful. But,
right. I have the benefit of dating a rich white Cuban girl, and then going and meeting her rich white Cuban family.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the social context also.
Right. Right. I was not doing an actual study of immigration by any means. It was personal experience.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we discussed pretty much everything.
Right. So to reiterate, the biggest points are, depending on the stakes of the algorithm, it determines how overfit or fit the algorithm is allowed to become. It is allowed to discriminate depending on the stakes of the decision that's being made on that. So life or death decisions, you use as much information and discriminate as closely as you can to get the best decision for the individual. When you're talking about social and economic impact situations, there are things that have to be put in place at a civil level to provide a level playing field for all the stakeholders involved, including the lender. I'll make one more point on that. So there was a lot of discussion in the United States a few years back about predatory lending. And they basically, what you saw from the social justice warriors, and I say that as someone who's friends with a lot of social justice people, is that they did not understand how credit scores work, and they did not understand how lending rates work. That they wanted to cap lending rates at 20%, and nobody is allowed to lend at a rate higher than 20%. Sounds like it makes sense. Nobody should be borrowing money at higher than a 20% rate, right? Wrong. There are some people that are at such a massive risk factor that the only way that it makes sense to lend to that group of people is if you can get a rate that guarantees a return on that group, right? So, for example, prison inmates, prisoners, they just got out, they're incredibly high risk, and I'm making up this group just because I want to demonstrate the point. As a group, they default on their loans 30% of the time, I'll say. What that means is that in order to get an actual return as a lender, I have to create an interest rate of 31% so that I can make money. If I set the interest rate at 29%, then I lose money on those loans. I am not in the business of losing money and giving money away to criminals, former criminals, prisoners. So if there is a law in place that says you're not allowed to lend anything above 20%, I will not lend to that group anymore at all. What you have just done by creating a law like that is essentially cut off that demographic of people that are in incredible need from any monetary lending at all. They cannot get a loan at all from anybody.
Because they would decide not to give the loan.
They would choose to not give the loan than to give it at 20%.
Yeah.
Right. So when you try to control lending practices in that way, you're essentially demonstrating two things. One, you don't understand how lending practices work. And two, you don't really care about the people that you're trying to help. You haven't dug into the problem enough. You've made a superficial judgment on how something should be handled and made a determination that these people are immoral. You're deciding that the lenders are immoral and unfair, and they're taking advantage of these people. And it's right in the name of the practice, which is predatory lending, right? Are there predatory lenders? Sure. They're called loan sharks, and they will kill you or beat you up or whatever to get their money back. That is illegal, and it should be. What should not be illegal is charging an interest rate of 50%, because there might be a demographic group that you come to me, I know that you steal money every single time somebody has given you a loan in the past. Does that mean you should never get a loan again? No. What it does mean is that I might want to lend to you, but I know it's going to be a gamble. There's a pretty good chance you're not going to pay me back. If you agree to pay me back at 50% and you pay me every week, X payment, I'll do it, because then I'll at least have a pretty good chance of making some money back. But it's a risk I'm taking, lending to some guy who never pays his debts back, and I should be compensated for taking on that risk. That's all it boils down to.
I guess you could say that it could be legal to do predatory lending, but also considering how do you divide the demographic group, so how you take the criteria to set those rates. But right. Yeah, I guess that's our story.
Yeah, that's a completely different conversation, really. And it's part of the conversation, but it goes into a completely different thing. And it really boils down to what we were saying before about legislating what discriminatory practices are acceptable and which ones are not. You can discriminate based off of credit history and payback rate and income and things like that, but you cannot discriminate based off of race or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
So hopefully this was informative and useful to you. I'll post it to YouTube later today and send you a link.
A lot learned. Yeah. Of course. And you said that this is going to be for one of your data classes, or what was it?
So I do YouTube videos, Data Fridays, and some of them I post. I haven't done one in a little while, but I used to give presentations to various people around data science and artificial intelligence and algorithm development and just various business topics. So this is a good one that I think a lot of people will be interested in. And your questions were good questions, but that what I saw in them was a little bit of naive approach and biased towards a lot of the social justice kind of mentality of how these things are approached. And there was an inherent implication in some of the questions, unintentionally, I will add, unintentionally, that the people making the decisions are not working in a fair manner or trying to act in a fair manner. The difference is that the idea that you are kind of proposing is to approach it from a technical mathematical perspective, whereas
with the premise that group fairness metrics do solve the problem. But it's exactly this what I was looking for.
Right.
Because of course I'm also looking for people to suggest if there's any kind of information that is missing. And
what you'll find
just
is
what
a lot of these,
influences their decision making, like you did, which is completely challenging the status quo, which of course it's very well received, and it gave foot to a very good conversation.
Right. What you'll find is a lot of these people that are experts in their specific areas, business areas or fields, they have moved away from trying to like control at a group level with these overfitting functions, and they've moved much more towards like in clinical trials, having data representation beyond biased. So the bigger thing is, how do we make the data that these algorithms are based off of less biased? And that has to do with recruiting practices for the trials, has to do with education around the benefits of participating in clinical trials. And the same thing is true of credit scores. You don't solve systemic historical biases and problems by just trying to normalize it across groups with an algorithm. You have to, adjust for the historical bias and provide education and training and extended networks and opportunity. You can't just, if these people have 5%, then these people need 5%. You can't do that because you're stealing from one group to give to another group, and that's going to cause civil unrest as well. And you've seen that in the United States when people talk about reparations or whatever, right? It causes an inherent backlash when you try to address it at a group level rather than at an individual level or at a data an education perspective. The algorithm is not that simple, is really what it boils down to.
And you also accept the fact that there is measurement bias or historical bias, and you're just trying to fix it, like have a quick fix in the decision.
Right. They're looking for a quick fix. When you start talking about doing error minimization across groups, you're looking for a quick fix is really what you're looking for. And there is no quick fix for some of these problems that are inherent in these algorithms. The algorithms themselves are just an axe. They're a tool, right? And they're going to serve the purpose of whatever that tool is built for. In credit, it's the tool's purpose is to identify risk. That's all it is. It doesn't care about ethnicity or race or whatever. If there is a signal there, it will find it and use it. It does not inherently. Algorithms are not racist. That's like saying a gun is racist or a hacksaw is racist. It's just a tool. It's how they're used and the people that are using them. And the type of for a saw, it's like nobody is like, well, this saw is a better saw than the other saw. Well, we have to make a saw that saws all wood equally. It makes nonsense. It's nonsense, right? No. We need to design a better saw that saws all pieces of wood at the same rate. That's kind of what the conversation sounds like to me. When reality is some saws are good on some types of wood and other saws are good on other types of wood. And you have to find the right tool for the right job. So, all right.
Perfect.
I'll stop there. If you have any follow-ups or anything, or you get anything you want to talk about, feel free to hit me up. Like I said, this is a topic I really enjoy, and I serve on social justice things, and I'm involved in a lot of this. So
complicated topic to reach to the one ultimate conclusion, but it was very, very fun, and thank you very much for your time. I really learned a lot, so I really appreciate it.
Right. Thanks, Alejandro. Feel free to, if you cite me or anything, just let me know, or if you take something, and feel free to credit me. It always makes me feel good. All right.
Perfect. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
See you later.